Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. This is Natasha Parker. I am super thrilled today to have the author of this amazing book that I just got last week called The Next Mormons: How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church. And along with her, I also have, well, I'm not sure I even said the name, Dr. Jana Reiss is the author. And then Dr. Benjamin Knoll, who helped her with the actual survey that was part of gathering the data that is basically talked about in this book. So I'm very excited to talk about this topic from a mental health perspective. I know they've been interviewed on lots of different radio shows and podcasts and all kinds of things already, which is wonderful. And I think that maybe we can take a little bit of a different viewpoint from a mental health lens. So I'm excited to do that tonight. Before I let them introduce themselves, I'd just like to give you a little bit of information about Mormon Mental Health Podcast. So this is a podcast that is sustainable only through your financial donations as listeners. So if you find this podcast valuable at all, please feel free to make a donation, which is super easy to do on mormonmentalhealth.org. It's a nonprofit organization, and therefore it's also tax deductible. We need about $10,000 to make this a sustainable podcast so I can pay my editors and cover all the costs of hosting and websites and all that kind of stuff. And I would say we are not on track to make that this year yet. You know, again, if you find it valuable, please donate. If everybody who listened would just donate a few dollars, we'd have no problems reaching that goal. So hopefully you'll be willing to help us out in that way. If you're interested in anything I'm involved with, presentations I'm doing, faith crisis workshops, which I have one coming up in April here in Kansas City, whatever, go to natashaparker.org. That's where you can find everything about me. And I am the host here at Mormon Mental Health. So yeah, and then non-financial ways that you can support Mormon Mental Health is to like our Facebook page, give us a positive review, either on iTunes or on Facebook, share maybe an episode on your pages that you feel would be helpful for friends or family. Lots of ways that you can non-financially support this project as well. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jana and Benjamin to the show. Is it okay if I call you by your first names now that I've got the introductions passed?
Absolutely.
Yes. All right. Why don't I give you both a chance to just introduce yourselves as far as professionally, and then we'll jump right into what the survey is all about and what you were interested in researching. So Jana, why don't you go first?
So thank you for having us. I'm Jana Reiss, and my doctorate is in the history of American religion. So I was not trained as a social scientist. This is new, which is why we have Ben, Commander Data, to help with all of the research in this very large project. I am a columnist for Religion News Service and have worked in and around the publishing industry for the last 20 years.
Thank you. And Ben, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Benjamin Knoll. I am a political science professor in Central Kentucky. I work at Center College. I teach classes on American politics, Congress and voting, elections, all that kind of fun stuff. And I also specialize in politics and religion, doing research on that end. Specifically, how can we understand religious and political behavior using public opinion surveys and statistical analysis to better understand those patterns in American society.
Okay, wonderful. So, and I also want to just remind listeners, especially those of you who are joining us via Facebook, is that we'll take comments and questions throughout the show. So feel free to, do that on the threads. I'll try to keep track of that as I'm also trying to listen and ask cool questions. So I'll try. All right. So why don't you just start us off by just telling us a little bit about the survey? What brought you to be interested in this topic to begin with? How did this whole thing get its beginnings? And then we can talk a little bit about what the results were.
Well, for me, it started out in around 2011, 2012, and it began originally as a book about Mormon childhood and adolescence. I didn't grow up Mormon. I'm an adult convert. And so I was always very interested in the stories of people I knew and friends I had who had grown up Mormon. And no one had really done a study of Mormon childhood. But as I began researching that, I became even more interested in who those people were as adults and how they were formed by a Mormon childhood and how certain elements of childhood religious training might or might not assist with adult retention and adult religiosity. So that's how this kind of came about. So the Next Mormon's survey, which we conducted in 2016, and Ben can describe a little bit more about the methodology behind that, was an attempt to try to ascertain also, is there intergenerational change and difference within the Mormon community itself? So how would young adult Mormons compare to older Mormons, as much as we can determine that?
Okay, you want to add what you'd like to add to that, Ben, as far as just how the survey came about and your interest in it in particular?
Yes. So as I said, my research deals with public opinion and voter behavior in the political science realm, but there's a lot of overlap with political behavior and religious behavior and the sociology of religion in terms of the research methodology. And so this is something that I had experience in before, designing research opinion polls and that sorts of thing. And so Jana and I began to work together on this to design the survey itself and then to field it and then to analyze it afterwards. So there's two different sets of data on which the results from the book are based. The first is an American nationally representative sample of both members of the LDS Church as well as those who say that they are former members of the LDS Church. And then also there are a number of interviews, one-on-one interviews that Jana performed. This is a common approach in social science research to use both statistical data as well as interview data because they both have their strengths and weaknesses. And so being able to take this multi-method approach better enables us and then Jana to be able to derive the conclusions that she does in her book.
Okay, great. So I thought I just would make a few bullet points just from me as a mental health professional and things that I was interested in looking at as I was reading through your data. And then so I will kind of bring up an issue that I think is, is intersection between mental health and then some of the issues around community and values and beliefs and doctrine and all those things. And then you can tell me a little bit about what you think might be interesting from that perspective. So that's kind of how I'm planning to do my questions in regards to this. So one of the things that I'm really interested in as a mental health practitioner is this concept of faith transitions, right? So how flexible is a religion in regards to allowing people both in and out of their kind of tribe types of dynamics? And, what I understand from a lot of the research that I've done in this particular perspective is that the more rigid or the more enmeshed a system might be around some of those topics, the harder it is for people from a relational and also mental health perspective. So if a community can be, can have a hard time letting go of their people, then obviously it's going to be more difficult for people to either leave or find or have permission to leave or to think differently. And by transitions, we also don't mean just leaving the community, but maybe having less orthodox or more nuanced approaches to the community. So having said that, that's one of my areas of interest. I work with a lot of transitioning Mormons. Can you tell me a little bit about what types of questions maybe you asked in that regard in response to faith transitions, and what were your findings?
Sure. So, Mormonism is not a particularly porous religion. My husband is a mainline Protestant. He's an Episcopalian. People come in and they go out all the time. Some people come to church once a month. Some people are gone for the winter. It's far more casual. Mormonism is a much more, I would say, committed, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way about other faiths, but Mormonism has some very high boundaries of belief and behavior in order to be considered an orthodox or active Latter-day Saint. And so that can contribute to happiness for people who are involved in the community. And there is some interesting research actually about high intensity religions contributing to happiness. But by the same token, it can also make it very painful and challenging for those who don't fit in and choose to stay, or those who choose to leave. And so we do have some data about why people choose to leave, how long it takes them to leave. And one of the things that we found, for example, in how long it takes people to leave is that for Mormons, 7 in 10 said that the process of a faith transition took them at least 6 months. And so this is not something that people are rushing into. This is not a rash decision where someone got offended on a Sunday and said, well, I'm never going to darken the door of that church again. You know, it's a much more complex and I would say a long process. And from the personal interviews, the oral history interviews, I would say an emotionally challenging process, especially in telling family members and children, spouses, parents. Very difficult.
Maybe I need to ask this question just to be clear about the data. When you did the survey, because you are focusing on millennials and kind of maybe younger generation, but I'm guessing you also surveyed a variety of ages, or do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can fill that one. We did, yes, interview. Legally speaking, they could be adults only. So this is people who self-identify as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, age 18 or over in the United States. We got a good cross-section of different age groups and demographic groups. We did intentionally try to deliberately seek out millennials because that was one of the topics of the book. But when we draw the comparisons, we use a statistical method to make sure that each age group is represented in proportion to which it is in the actual Mormon population, according to Pew Research. And so we do have that good chunk of millennials there, from which we're able to draw some interesting conclusions.
So in essence, that's where you can make some of these comparisons. So I guess what I'm curious about is, did you find the experience of a younger generation faith transitioner different than maybe the older generations?
I don't think we could speak qualitatively in any kind of definitive way that the experience is different. We could tell you the reasons for leaving can differ. For younger Mormons, judgment, and this is, a mental health issue, the tied for first was I felt judged or misunderstood at church. That ranked first for all women of, all generations combined, but for women, that was first. For men, it was significantly lower. And that's interesting, so you want to look at the culture and say, well, what's going on here that younger people and women feel somehow judged in this culture?
Was there any ability to look a little bit more into that as far as social justice topics? I mean, I'm assuming when you say women, there's obviously issues of patriarchy. How well was it able to say, okay, maybe these are some particular reasons within that sense of inclusion as to why people might be feeling not included, not heard, not have a voice?
That is complicated. We can tell you quantitatively, but it sounds like what you're asking for is the why behind it, and we can speculate about that, and I can give you some oral history information, but that's not data. In the data, though, you mentioned social issues. For millennials, LGBT issues ranked third. It was not a factor for older Mormons who had left the church to nearly the same degree. So that certainly seems important. Also, if you are looking at all women who have left the church, women's issues ranked third for women and like 24th for men. So men were not as exercised about women's issues, men who'd left the church, as women who'd left the church. So, in the LDS tradition, we hear sometimes women are happy, women are satisfied with the way things are. And in our data, because we have two sets of data, if we look at currently identified Mormons, a majority are happy. Even younger women, it's certainly more split for them. They are more interested in egalitarian marriage, for example. They are more bothered by women not having the priesthood. But they're still in the church. But for former Mormon women, it seems like women's issues was actually a very present reason why they left. So if you're going to say, Mormon women are happy with the way things are, that's true. But former Mormon women obviously weren't necessarily happy with the way things were. And that was a contributing factor, apparently. Ben, do you have stuff to add to that?
No, you summarized that very well.
Oh, well, thank you.
Well, and I'm thinking about, yes, so I will probably interject, my lived experience and the lived experiences of my clients, which again, I appreciate your reminder that that is not data. We can make lots of assumptions from data, which is something that we all should watch because we're more likely, I think, as human beings to look at data from our perspectives, right? And our experiences, and then make correlations that may or may not be, or causations in particular that may or may not be accurate. So at the same time, though, when I think about my own lived experience as a Mormon woman who became more feminist in her ideas over a period of time, my level of happiness that I would have reported at a younger age would have been much higher than my level of happiness today. And so I would say some of that just came from awareness of issues that I wasn't aware of as much when I was younger. And secondly, I think what you're saying then is that at some point we need to not just say, oh, Mormons are happy, quote unquote, because there's this huge population of post-Mormons or people who are no longer considering themselves Mormons who left the tribe or maybe no longer participate in the tribe who once would have been Mormons who were unhappy. And they can't say they're unhappy because they're no longer Mormons, right? So they're not in that bucket. Is that kind of what you're explaining?
Yes, that it's important to tell both parts of that story.
Right. Okay. All right. So you mentioned, you said several things were third on the list as to why people were dissatisfied. And so since we're kind of still on the topic of faith transitions, what were the top two reasons why people, felt like this was a huge part of my leaving?
Well, if you want all of them, I'm going to have to open up the document. So Ben.
That's okay. It's okay to take the time to do that.
It might be a little bit of a tangent, but asking about specifically the topic of faith transitions, oftentimes that has to do with certainty of belief in various faith propositions or truth propositions of a religious community, in this case, the LDS community. We asked a number of different questions that tried to assess the degree of certainty or the level of belief that people had. In a variety of things, both just in general Christianity, like I believe that God is real or that Jesus Christ literally died and was resurrected from the dead, but also some specific LDS specific ones, such as the historicity of the Book of Mormon or temple ordinances being the only way ultimately for families to be together in the afterlife, things like that. Then we also asked just a more generic question about teachings of the LDS Church. On that one, from the perspective of those who are interested in the church doing well, there's really good news there. More than 4 out of 5 members of the church say, I at least have faith or believe wholeheartedly in most or all of the teachings of the LDS Church. So on average, on any given Sunday, 4 out of 5 people there are part of the team. They're believers and they're on board, and that's a very good thing. From that perspective. But at the same time, there's around 17% of people who are who say that they are members of the church, who say that they might believe some things, but they have their doubts, or they don't believe most things, or they just don't believe at all the teachings of the LDS Church. That might seem like a small number, 17%, but 1 out of 5 people in church on Sunday, that's not nothing. That's a good chunk of congregations on average. And when you narrow it down to those who are attending every week, it's still fairly high. It doesn't go down all that much. There's about 10 to 15% of active Mormons who are either skeptical or just non-believers in the doctrine. So the question with that is, what's the experience like for those people? Are they experiencing that tension that you're talking about? Could that lead to those kinds of mental health issues? That's a real concern. Now, it's true, they're not the majority. Most people are happy, and that's our survey showed that. But there's a non-trivial segment of the church, at least in the United States, for whom the strong certainty of belief and the culture of that is not resonating with them.
Which I'm guessing, might have something to do with feeling included or feeling like you're part of the group. And like Jana, you said at the beginning, these transitions oftentimes take 6 months. And I find that to be a short amount of time, at least in my anecdotal experience, right? Of working with people, it can be years, right? So if you're in that fifth, percentile, or a fifth of the percentile for a long period of time, feeling like you don't quite fit in, people don't quite appreciate your comments, you're not quite included, that can take a toll that, although maybe they would have enjoyed or wanted to stay put, it became a little bit difficult to do that. That's my assumption from some of what you're saying. Did I interrupt you, Jana? Did you want to say something?
No, I interrupted you, in fact. I'm sorry. I did find the overall rankings. Do you want the reasons for leaving by generation, by gender, everyone together?
Why don't we start with everybody together, and then, give us the gender one, I think would be important, and the generation one would be nice to know as well.
All right, well, let's focus then on the top 5 for those categories, since otherwise it would be pretty overwhelming.
Yes.
For all former Mormons together, the number one reason was I could no longer reconcile my personal values and priorities with those of the church. So a fairly general assessment. Number 2 is a testimony thing. I stopped believing there was one true church. 3, I did not trust the church leadership to tell the truth surrounding controversial or historical issues. 4, I felt judged or misunderstood. And 5, I drifted away from Mormonism. So when you put everyone together, those are the top 5. If we're looking just at millennials, as I said, the I felt judged or misunderstood was tied for first, and that had been fourth in the overall assessment, so it's kind of zoomed up there a little bit. It's tied for the I did not trust the church leadership. And then third for millennials is the church's positions on LGBT issues. So like I said, that has become more important. Number 4 was the I could no longer reconcile my personal values. And number 5, I drifted away from Mormon. And for women and men, looking at reasons for leaving by gender. So for women, as I said earlier, I felt judged or misunderstood was listed as the top, that ranked as the top reason. I could no longer reconcile my personal values was second. And third was the role of women in the church, which was very interesting, considering it ranked so low for men. Number 4 was I stopped believing, and then number 5 was I did not trust church leaders. For women, the LGBT issues, just to add that, was 7th overall.
Okay.
For men, I stopped believing there was one true church was first, and then I could no longer reconcile my personal values was second. I did not trust church leaders was third. I drifted away from Mormonism. And then here's something different. Number 5 for men was lack of historical evidence for the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. That really, of all of the doctrinal or specific historical issues that we offered as possible reasons for leaving the church, that was the only one that had traction in zooming up into the top 10 overall and also being in the top 5 for men. So lack of historical evidence for the Book of Mormon was interesting.
Okay. That's thank you for breaking that out. I do think that's really interesting. And I think that, the authority one kind of stands out for me, especially just understanding through, not religious research necessarily, but as we talk about millennials from a kind of socio-cultural way, it seems to me that that's a theme, that they're less willing to just trust authority as maybe 3 or 4 generations back, where that seemed to be a very important aspect of being loyal to your community. You trust authority, you do what you're told and what you're expected, whereas we're more in an information age and they're quickly able to kind of fact check us and they're not as willing to just put their trust in any leader per se. And you see that both in politics and in religion and other aspects. Is that something either one of you would want to comment on?
Yes, I'd like to hear what Ben has to say about this as well, but just to chime in, we have several different metrics to try to gauge how millennials feel about authority. Well, how Mormons in general and former Mormons feel about authority. And in the current Mormon population, it is a very believing and trusting population in general, but there is generational difference. And for millennials who are in the church, there are some indicators that kind of default mode where you would simply obey without question is softening in this generation. For example, for millennials, they split almost exactly 50-50 on the binary question we asked, which was, if you feel that something you're hearing from your priesthood leaders conflicts with what you're getting in your personal revelation, what do you privilege? And for millennials, it was half and half. For baby boomers and silent generation, basically 2/3 say you obey the priesthood no matter what, whatever questions you may have. Also, general conference viewership seems to be significantly down among millennials compared to older Latter-day Saints, to the tune of a 30-point viewership drop, which was very significant and interesting. So what is it about general conference that does not seem to be grabbing them as a viewing activity? That doesn't mean they're not reading it or listening to it as a podcast. We only ask the question as a viewing activity. And a couple of other things as well. So there is a chapter in the book about authority, and it was a very interesting one to write. So there are several other kinds of metrics that we discuss in that chapter. Ben, what would you add to that?
I'd add that in addition to the ways that we got at it with those questions, there was also another set of questions that gave respondents a list of about 10 or 12 different types of sources of authority in their lives. Things from LDS church leaders, general authorities, or LDS local leaders, or scriptures, or their spouse or family, or personal revelation, or friends, or philosophy and reason, or common sense, or even celebrities like Stephen Colbert, Brene Brown, and people like them. Mm-hmm. And so that was able to get a little more nuance there. It was interesting to see there that on average, members of the LDS Church tend to put their own personal conscience and inspirations slightly higher on average than LDS institutional authority and stuff, which are still high up there, to be sure. But that seems like it's a tension amongst members that they put both of them very high, and it works great when they're both in agreement. But then when they disagree, that's when difficult choices are often tends to be made, and that can create that emotional tension and anxiety, I think, that then you specialize in and make a career out of.
Right. And I want to be clear that I don't think there's any psychologist that's going to say emotional tension is unhealthy. In fact, we see that as kind of a normal part of life, and everybody has to grapple with their values and with ethics and with dilemmas, right, that have to do with their faith, with their religion, with their family of origin, with their culture, right, with their race. I mean, there's so many factors that go into a lived experience. So that's not necessarily a con. At the same time, I think where it can be a little easier is when the community itself celebrates that or sees that as part of developmental growth. And I think that, as you said at the very beginning of this kind of bullet point, Jana, that we tend to be less porous, I think was the word you used in that regard, as an overall community. But this idea of the tension between personal agency and authority is, I think, a somewhat healthy one for people to grapple with regardless.
Well said.
Oh, okay. So I'd like to, one of the other things that I thought about are lifestyle issues. And this maybe goes along with the authority issue a little bit as well. Mental health in a lot of ways focuses on people's authenticity, people's ability to, be able to learn from within, not necessarily, as therapists, especially, we're trained not to just give advice and give answers, right? That we're supposed to create a space for people to bring their issues, and hopefully through some, exploration, they can come kind of to their own conclusions, because we see personal authority as very important in a person's development and their growth and in their mental health. So that leads to lifestyle decisions, right? So what do I do with my behavior if I feel like I'm going to orient myself, or, that I feel the identity of a gay or lesbian member of the church? What am I going to do? How am I going to behave if I feel my authenticity as a female and don't agree with the fact that my authority is always needing to be less than in that regard? What am I going to do if I, I'm not in accordance with how the church spends its money, but still want to tithe or still want to be charitable? There's so many different lifestyle decisions, but some that really stood out to me in your book was single members of the church, so members who are not married, some of the gender roles, such as especially for women, behaving towards motherhood, making choices towards motherhood, and the LGBTQ, bucket. So I'd like to, in particular, talk maybe a little bit about those three and what you found as far as people grappling with some of those areas in lifestyle that the church doesn't always mesh well with the people living in their lived experiences.
Well, I'm going to put my reading glasses on here and just read a little piece of the book. My favorite chapter to write was the singles chapter. It's called Single Mormons in a Married Church. And this interview really stuck in my mind, the one that opens the chapter. So I'm just going to read that if that's all right with you.
Please, yes, thank you.
So when Naomi was a teenager, she and the other young women in her ward, were assigned to make lists of the qualities they were looking for in a future husband, and to work on acquiring the qualities a future husband might want in a wife. Many lessons on Sundays and weeknights involved preparing for the marriages the girls would one day have. No alternatives to marriage were presented. Singleness was not mentioned as a desirable life choice, either in the curriculum or by way of example. Most of her young women leaders were themselves married, though Naomi remembers a few older single women in their late 20s and early 30s whom she regarded with something like pity. She was confident that she would never be like that. She knew this because she had a plan. She would graduate from college, serve a mission, get married, and have babies in that order. That was the narrative, she said, that all those things would happen in a row. Only they didn't. She didn't meet her eternal companion and have a chubby Mormon baby within a year of a temple wedding. Apart from the college degree, none of her original plans came to pass. Perhaps the hardest part of it was that the narrative did seem to work out for others. She said, you watch people around you where it does happen exactly like that. Your friend, your roommate, meets someone one day and gets married, and you think, wait, I've been doing exactly what that person is doing, and why is the outcome so different? Not that I see life as a vending machine where you put certain things in and can expect certain things to come out, but it's easy to fall into the trap of questioning yourself when you can see the narrative working out for the people all around you. And so the story picks up with Naomi at age 38, still single, really evaluating not only her marital situation, but her entire religiosity, because the church has taught her that this is her role in life, that she's supposed to be a wife and a mother. And so who is she if that hasn't worked out for her? And there were a lot of Naomis, and not just women actually, but also men that I spoke to who were also wondering, why has this not happened for me? And what's my role here in a church that so heavily emphasizes the family? Statistically, we can tell you that singles are more heavily represented in the former Mormon population than they are in the current Mormon population. Not by a huge amount, but it's noticeable. And singles also who are still in the church have decreased measures of religiosity. So church attendance is lower, word of wisdom adherence is lower, general conference viewership is lower. And so you wonder what's going on with that. And is there a causative relationship there? We don't know. But is it possible that singles have less attendance at general conference, for example, because they don't want to hear yet again that they're failing in some way by not being married? We don't know, but it's certainly a hypothesis.
And to be clear, nobody's telling singles directly that they're failing because they're not married necessarily. But when you have the entire message focused on the roles of parenting, of marriage, of spousal kind of roles and responsibilities, although there are some shaming comments that have been directed at singles, but in general, I think that they've been upping the loving kind of rhetoric towards singles, and yet I don't necessarily see them feeling any more accepted, because just almost every lesson is about the family unit in some way or another. What are you going to teach your kids? How are you going to do a temple marriage? How are you going to prioritize your family relationships? And so it's very spousal and parenting heavy in our church, for sure.
Well, and from a sociological perspective, that's what the church needs to do if it wants to still be a church 100 years ago.
Right.
Because statistically, people who are married and have children are more likely to be religiously involved. They're more likely to be givers, and a lot of different indices of that. So you can understand why church leaders would be concerned if there's a higher percentage of people who are not getting married, or if they are getting married later. Our data actually did not show a higher age of marriage among those who get married. But yeah, I mean, demographically, the church is changing just as American culture is changing. Ben, we haven't heard from you in a while. What do you have to say about singles in the church?
Well, on that one, what came to mind for me is not necessarily something from the book or the survey we did, but just personal experience. So it's anecdotal, survey of one family here. But what you're saying, Natasha, about the strong emphasis not only on marriage, but also on children. My wife and I, when we got married, it became very apparent quickly that it was not going to be easy for us to have children and do the narrative, right? And be able to do the thing. Nearly 15 years later, we've got 3 energetic young kids, and that's wonderful. But it took us a lot longer than would have been the preference or what we would have expected. And for many years, that was something that was very difficult for my wife and I, and caused a good deal of emotional angst, anxiety, and that kind of thing because of those narratives, right?
Right.
That idea that if your sole purpose in the cosmos and universe is to have a family and have kids, and you can't become like God unless you yourself have children as well, that creates a tension there. And that was very difficult. And I don't want to make it seem like our experiences is representative, of course, because lots of people are still, it hasn't worked for them. Our story was unique in that way, but, and I'm glad that we have seen general conference talks and things from church leaders that are better at acknowledging those kinds of realities and dealing with it too. But the fact still remains that LDS church culture is very, very strongly, heavily oriented toward traditional family and children. And for those for whom it works, that's a great thing. But it does make it difficult for those who don't necessarily fit and check every single box.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I haven't worked with anybody I can think of around infertility that didn't come with a lot of shame, a lot of reframing, a lot of that wondering of personal blame. What am I doing wrong? Even if they didn't intellectually believe it, sometimes people are like, I know it's silly that I think that, right? Like I shouldn't think that. And yet the emotional experience can be very different than our intellectual experience. And it can be very based in shame that we're not fitting into that narrative that's so culturally prevalent. Mm-hmm. Anything either one of you would want to say about the LGBTQ population?
Sure. So our LGBT population of people who are still in the church is a little lower than it is for those who are out of the church. I think that will surprise very few people, that it's hard to stay in the church and be a non-heterosexual, self-identifying as a non-heterosexual. The population was small enough that we really can't draw a lot of conclusions about the religiosity or the religious practices of LGBT people who remain. So I'm just going by national research here, which indicates that often religiosity is lower, and that is kind of understandable. We did look, and I think this made it into the book. I'd have to go back and see what got cut, when I was trying to make cuts. But I think that in the book, there is still a brief analysis of some of the views of the LGB, I should say, because the T is on a different question. That's on the gender question, not the sexual orientation question. But LGB Mormons and how they feel about different theological issues and how they ranked on the different testimony questions. I think that still made it into the book.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and I'm guessing you're saying not surprising that we would have a larger population out, because in a sense, the church isn't providing really a sustainable space for them to stay, would be the way that I would formulate that.
I think that's accurate. And one of the things that I've heard some liberal Mormons and former Mormons express disappointment about in our survey, as though we are morally responsible for how all survey respondents feel, is that the 2015 exclusion policy, LGBT exclusion policy, has majority support among currently identified Latter-day Saints. A majority of Mormons approve of this policy. And, I think for liberal Mormons, perhaps in social media echo chambers, it can be easy to believe, oh, everyone is opposed to this or everyone is against it. And that's just not statistically true. So this reinforces the idea that if you are lesbian, gay, or bisexual in the church, it can be a very uncomfortable place to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would imagine that's a somewhat cyclical dynamic. I really doubt the church, the church, which I guess is the primary leadership, is going to come out with something that's so unpopular that it's not going to be supported by, the general population. I was actually kind of surprised. I knew that it would be a majority. I was kind of surprised that it wasn't as majority as I thought it would be. So that was actually
particularly for women, which is very
yes. Which I forget now what the numbers were, but I want to say it was just over 50%, or was it more in the 60?
About 4 in 10 currently identified Mormon women say that they disagree with the second part of the policy about children. Should children of same-sex couples be permitted to be baptized or blessed? And on that issue in particular, it wasn't a majority, but a very strong plurality of Mormon women, Orthodox, otherwise, faithful, believing Mormon women said they had an issue with that. So that was very interesting to me.
Yeah, very interesting. Any thoughts from you, Ben, as far as the LGBTQ plus data, which I understand the T is very different, and I'm not, how much did it go into the T category? Can you talk a little bit about the transgender or gender identity issues that you maybe studied?
With the T portion specifically, again, just very, very, very small. With a population that small, it's very difficult to be able to draw any kind of real solid, conclusive patterns or anything like that. But getting back to the topic that you were just discussing, I think I agree with you in the sense of, given the way in which this particular policy was presented by church leaders, and after it happened a couple months later when President Nelson gave that one talk about becoming millennials, and more or less said that this policy was something that had arrived as a direct revelation with everyone in the upper room of the temple, like very similar to the lifting of the priesthood ban and things of this nature. Given that still a quarter of self-identified Latter-day Saints would say, no, I disagree with that, that gets back to that authority tension we were talking about earlier. That's not just inactive members. That's amongst people who have temple recommends and who are in the pews every week and say that they're fully active, that a solid minority of them would go against something that was so strongly presented as the divine will of God, yet are still there every week. That says something, that speaks to those tensions of authority and individuality that are ongoing in LDS culture in the United States today.
Super interesting. Okay, I want to talk about 2 more things, and I know our hour's coming up quickly because I want to be very cognizant of your time that you're spending with me tonight. So maybe you can decide which one to spend more time on. But I do think it's interesting, again, from a mental health perspective, a lot of it is identity work. Who am I? What am I about? And one of the things I find in particular with working with Mormon and nuanced Mormon women and post-Mormon women across the board, even the believing women, that they struggle, especially the younger ones, with this kind of soul identity that we put so much emphasis on, which is that of motherhood. And many, especially in post-Mormonism, have a lot of angst and regret and anger for missed opportunities when they were trying to develop themselves or thinking of developing themselves in more than just one identity. So, and I always thought this was interesting, just even in some panels that I was invited to actually by the church office many years ago, all of us that were invited onto the panel were PhDs and masters and professionals. And I was like, where are the stay-at-home moms here on this panel? Because they're the ones that obeyed you. And we are all the disobedient ones here. Why are you interested in listening to us? So I thought that was an interesting dilemma that the church is in. The second point I really am interested in, of course, because I'm a sex therapist, was your research on sexual behavior and how people are willing to comply or not comply with the kind of sexual, do's and don'ts that the church is fairly strict about in our religious community. So there's my 2 topics. what do you want to talk about?
Well, sex, of course, right? We haven't talked a lot about gender, but let's talk about sex. So, it was very interesting in this list of sexual behavior questions. First of all, how many people responded to the question at all. We had very few people say that they preferred not to answer. That was offered as an option so that people would not have to reveal their sexual history, but very few people took that option, which was interesting. And now that I'm someone who is in these pools that takes random surveys, mostly about politics and, lip balm and consumer questions, they know everything about me. So you sort of lose your inhibitions. It's like childbirth. Once you take a lot of these surveys, you do about yourself. So maybe there's some of that going on. It was very interesting to see that for currently identified Mormons, so people who are still in the church, premarital sexual behavior was pretty much at half the level it was for people who had left the church. And that's a very significant finding, and we cannot attribute causation one way or the other. We don't know because we did not ask this. Was your sexual behavior a catalyst to leaving the church, or did it come first, or was it something that you left the church and then engaged in sexual behavior that the church would not have approved of? We don't know that. But we can tell you that on many of these indices, sexual intercourse, oral sex, etc., it's about twice as much in the former Mormon population as it is among current Mormons. Ben?
Yeah, anything you want to say, Ben, about either one of those topics?
No, you've got the lists there in front of you there. I don't have those figures memorized off the top of my head.
I don't either, but I do have the book here, and I can pull up that chart about sex.
Well, I will say, as a sex therapist, I was a little bit challenged in reading some of your reports in my own, I guess, assumptions, because since I didn't know, I just assumed that believing behavior wouldn't be that different from maybe non-believing behavior when it came to sexuality, especially among singles and, youth, teens when they're kind of, sexually developing. And it seemed to me like actually that was not the case, that there is kind of a difference between those who adhere to more believing practices than those who don't. So that was good information for me to know, because I wouldn't have known that otherwise. It's kind of like, sometimes I think Mormons, we tend to like to think that we're better at everything than everybody else, right? But when I look at the divorce statistics, it seems to me like we're not that different necessarily. We are slightly different, but not that different. It feels like the areas where we are quite different in behavior is word of wisdom, like alcohol and drugs. That seems to be where we're different from the kind of general population. But then you weren't studying the general population either, so I'm not sure if I was reading all of that correctly.
It's very complicated to compare one study against another. For example, in the chapter on religious behavior that discusses word of wisdom, we can use findings from other surveys about how much Americans drink coffee or alcohol, but they're not asking the exact same question. Our question was, have you had any of the following in the last 6 months? Which is a very different question from, do you drink alcohol once a week or coffee every day? So we can't compare apples to oranges very easily. Let's go back to sex, though, just for a moment here, because I found that chart. So in the chapter on singles, this is where I talk a little bit about sexual behavior among Latter-day Saints and the law of chastity. So for current Mormons, 31% said that they had sexual intercourse before marriage. That is significantly below the national average. 65% of former Mormons said that they had sex, which is almost on par with the national average, which is more like 70%. I think Orthodox Mormons could look at that in one of two ways. They could say, wow, hey, our sexual intercourse rate before marriage is less than half that of the national population. We're really succeeding. Or they might say, wow, nearly a third of currently identified Latter-day Saints say that they had sexual intercourse before marriage. That's terrible. It just depends on whether you think the glass is half full or not. Oral sex, 59% of former Mormons say they had oral sex as a premarital sexual behavior. 28% of current Mormons. Fondling a partner without clothing, 63.5% of former Mormons versus 33% of current Mormons. So you can see it's kind of almost a 2-to-1 ratio on most of these issues, and that is a very interesting finding.
Well, and this is where I think, and I think you spoke to this in the book, if I read you correctly. I was really reading fast because I was trying to get ready for this. I want to go back and read your book a little slower. But one of the things, it seems to me like if we're talking about premarital experience, even though they're former Mormons that you are now surveying, they were probably Mormon during their premarital experience, a lot of them, like as teenagers or young adults. And so for me, it was interesting to think about it from the perspective of like a lot of these people who have left, who now consider themselves post-Mormon, are double the rate in this particular regard, especially looking at the amount of shame that I think we place on sexual behavior. I think it's very high. That's my experience in the Mormon cultures, that we're very shaming about any premarital behavior. And so I just can't help but wonder if that's part of the journey out, is that sense of punishment or shame or not being included or not feeling welcome is part of that development. Now you can rip me apart as far as making that correlation. So what are your thoughts?
Something I could add to that, Natasha. This isn't something that's from the book specifically, but we're doing some preliminary research right now for future projects, one of which focuses more specifically on the disaffiliation factor and what things increase or decrease the likelihood that someone leaves the church at some point in their lives, from the data we have in our survey here. And so from this, and so keep in mind, this is tentative. It hasn't gone through the peer review process or anything like that, but there is some indication that suggests that there is a link between that premarital sex and later disaffiliation, even after controlling for other demographic variables. But it was really interesting. This pattern was present for only older people as opposed to younger people. And it was only older women, but not older men. So for millennials, the link between these two things isn't as strong as for older members. And it's much more for women that then had premarital sex, who then are more likely to leave than men are. Same thing for getting married in the temple. For older women who did not get married in the temple, they were later more likely to leave, but older men who didn't were no more or less likely to leave than otherwise. So thinking about the shame thing here, in previous generations, this is suggestive. Again, it's not conclusive, there's correlations, and this is very tentative, but it's suggestive that shaming culture was perhaps stronger in previous generations than it is more recently. That said, of course, you're very correct to say that it's still a very strong part of the culture, but in an optimistic light, this might be some indication that shaming culture is getting better to some extent.
Yeah. Well, in a mix of the maybe slightly less shaming rhetoric and this mix of also questioning authority more. You mix those two together and you can see how maybe millennials are slightly more resilient to some of those messaging. That's one way to look at it, I'm guessing. I don't know. I'm probably like too quick to go to correlation and causation. You both are probably like, stop it.
I feel like I spend a significant portion of these interviews saying the equivalent of slow down cowboy. Whoever is interviewing us has this question and has made some interpretations, and we say, well, maybe that's entirely a possible interpretation, but we cannot confirm that or refute it because the data does not conclusively.
Right.
So limited by the questions in the survey. It was a very extensive survey, but it's still limited.
Yes. Well, that's okay. So last question then. What didn't I ask you about that you're like, I thought we'd talk about this, or I thought we would we'd have the chance to talk about this point.
So Jana, what about the anxiety medication question?
Right. We did have a question about medication, which we've broken out by gender. There is a pervasive stereotype that Mormon women are secretly depressed and, are popping Valiums here and there. But it does not look like Mormon women are taking medication perhaps at rates that are any higher than women in the national population. again, it's hard to compare that because what we were asking is, have you taken medication for anxiety or depression at any point in your life, or are you currently taking it? But I haven't found an exactly equivalent comparative point for that. But still, for women compared to men, in the Mormon population, very similar to the national population, women seem to be almost twice as likely to say that they have taken medication, but that's not actually that different from women in the US population. And whether it's because women are simply more likely to seek help or women are experiencing depression more often, you would know that far more than I'm sure, but it was still kind of an interesting finding.
Yeah, that has a lot of possibilities to it. Women might be willing to ask more help. I've even thought of, Mormon women sometimes are task oriented. And so if like the treatment for depression is go in, get your medical assessment done, like go do talk therapy, they might be more willing to do that than the general population. And then we get a bad rap for being more depressed. I don't know. Those are complicated issues because also the culture of perfectionism isn't necessarily that great. And I have found, again, anecdotally, Mormon women feeling guilty and anxious and depressed over really, I think tragic things, like things that are fairly normal and they're doing their best, but they don't feel like they're good enough. So that's an interesting, but I'm glad you brought that up. Any other things that I missed that would be interesting?
I have one more thing. Ben, did you have anything to add?
Just simply a plug. If people are interested, the book and the survey have a website. It's thenextmormons.org, and we've got detailed information about the survey, where to get the book if you're interested, as well as a collection of various blog posts, interviews, write-ups of various parts of the survey that have been published. It's not 100% up to date. I haven't been able to get to that for a week or two now, but that's on my to-do list. But it's got a good deal of information there, as well as information about how the survey was done and the questionnaire for those who are interested. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to go take a look at that. And
say the website one more time. I'll definitely link to that.
Right. It's thenextmormons.org. All one word, lowercase.
Perfect. Okay, I'll definitely do that. And then Jana, you said you had one last point you wanted to touch on.
So just one last thing. We had a binary question given to the former Mormons about their levels of happiness, and I thought this might be interesting for some of your listeners. The question was, since leaving the church, I have felt primarily either anger, loss and grief, or freedom, possibility, and relief. And it was very surprising to us that 93% of our former Mormon population chose freedom, possibility, and relief. That's a huge number. Ben has done some additional analysis of that to see what about that other 7%, and how long have those people been out of the church. Formulating a hypothesis from what we know, it seems that there is a period of maybe profound agitation or unhappiness that people pass through to get to the other side of it. I don't know, Ben, what would you say?
I'm looking up the information for that right now, because there was a couple of other I'd have to look into that, but yes, part of it was that's okay. Going off memory, so don't take this as a certain thing, but yes, the closer one was to having made that transition, the more likely they were to say that they felt that they felt the anxiety and the loss and grief from that, as opposed to freedom and happiness, et cetera, et cetera. Also, it mattered their friendship and family circles, more homogenously LDS their families were, especially. That makes a difference in terms of predicting that. But even then, it's moving the needle from, say, 7% to up to 15 to 20%. Still, the vast majority of people say that they feel happiness and freedom when they make that change there. So from the perspective of those who are thinking about ways to keep members in the church, that's something to, I guess, to be considering, not to say that that's a good thing if they then go to leave. But in terms of a person's just general life satisfaction and mental health, that's something to be taking into consideration in the mix of all of these various things here. What could be done then to help the people who want to stay not feel like that there's that grief and that anguish there, but feel that sense of freedom and relief while staying in, as opposed to feeling like they have to make that separation somehow?
I love that. And I love that that's kind of how we're ending, because, it sounds like you said at the beginning that people who identify as Mormons and believers will also say, that they have a level of happiness. And post-Mormons who've been kind of through that dark night of the soul, which is a very normal grief process, will also say that they are finding satisfaction and contentment and happiness. And so I think what I find a lot I usually work in the fence between those two worlds, is that the believing Mormons are like, oh, you're never going to be happy on that side of the fence. And the post-Mormons are like, oh, you're not really happy, because you don't know any better. And I'm saying maybe people are happy where they're at, and that's a personal journey. And that's a huge part of kind of, having to figure out what's going to work in your life. So that goes back to that kind of internal authority that so much about mental health is about. So thank you so much for coming on and spending this hour and a little bit more than that with me. I really appreciate it. I'm thrilled with your work. I think it's so interesting. I'm always looking for data around Mormons, and it's hard to find sometimes. So I think that this is just really beneficial to our community. So thank you for doing the work, and thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Well, thank you for having us. It was fun.
Yes, thank you, Natasha.
Great. Thank you. I hope to meet you both soon, hopefully in person rather than this way, but we'll see if our paths cross at some point. Take care, everybody. Good night. Please make a donation if you find these kinds of podcasts valuable to you. MormonMentalHealth.org is where you can go, and they're also available on iTunes. And thank you for joining us tonight, or maybe later as you're listening to us on your audio format. So take care, everybody. Good night.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at MormonMentalHealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous song Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while